The goal of the 19th is really to change the conversation around how we talk about women and LGBTQ people in politics.
We are firm believers that all issues are women's issues. Our readers are people who want to be better informed and better able to participate in democracy.
We're aiming to change the future of American journalism by giving women and the LGBTQ community the platform and the voice that they deserve.
There's never been a better moment than right now.
The 19th is the newsroom that we've been waiting for.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Live with the 19th. It is our last live event of 2021. I'm Amanda Zamora, co-founder and publisher of The 19th, an independent nonprofit newsroom that aims to empower you with the information, resources, and community you need to be equal participants in our democracy. The United Nations has called climate change the defining crisis of our time. The planet is in peril, and extreme weather events are already causing displacement and food and water insecurity. But world leaders appear unable to agree on collective action and policy changes amid corporate influence, disinformation campaigns, and political gridlock. As nations struggle to confront this crisis, what can individuals and communities learn from climate scientists and grassroots leaders? How can we, as in you and me, reimagine a healthier planet? Today, the 19th is working in collaboration with Grist to hold an important conversation about the urgency of this moment. Before we get started, we'd like to thank our exclusive sponsor, the Walton Family Foundation. Moira McDonald, Ph.D., leads the Walton Family Foundation's environmental program and is here to share a few words.
Good afternoon. My name is Moira McDonald, and I lead the environment program at the Walton Family Foundation. On behalf of our board and our staff, I want to thank you all for joining today's discussion. Studies show that more than 85% of the global population is feeling the impacts of climate change, whether it's droughts or floods, megastorms or wildfires. Most people experience the realities of climate change most clearly and most concretely through water. At the Walton Family Foundation, we believe that the people closest to the problem are also the ones that are closest to the solution. So when it comes to protecting and conserving water resources during climate change, we focus our efforts on supporting the people and communities who are doing the hard work of finding solutions that allow nature and people to thrive together. We believe that despite the challenges of climate change, there are still practical reasons to be hopeful and to take action. That's why we're so happy to support the 19th and this kind of dialogue that brings people together for solutions and for action. Thank you again for joining today.
A quick reminder that while sponsors and donors help to keep Live with the 19th free for viewers like you to attend, they play no part in the programming of our events. As our conversation kicks off, we hope you'll share what resonates with you on social media using the hashtag #the19thlive. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our free newsletter, you can do that now at 19thnews.org/subscribe, where you'll find out about upcoming 19th News events, read our journalism, and more. Now, I'm delighted to introduce our distinguished panel. Katharine Coleman Flowers is a MacArthur Grant-winning activist and founder of the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, which is dedicated to improving access to clean air, water, and soil in marginalized communities. She's also the author of Waste, One Woman's Fight Against America's Dirty Secret. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservatory. She is the author of Saving Us, a climate scientist's case for hope and healing in a divided world, as well as the writer and producer of PBS Digital Studios' Global Weirding, Climate, Politics, and Religion series. Climate activist and lawyer Colette Pichon Battle is founder and executive director of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, a nonprofit public interest firm that formed in the aftermath of Hurricanes Katrina and Rita. Moderating this conversation is Zoya Teirstein, who reports on public health and climate for the nonprofit newsroom Grist. Zoya?
So something I've been thinking about recently is about how we're in this sort of unique moment in the conversation around climate change. It seems like the both sidesism debate is somewhat over, thankfully. Extreme weather is becoming more and more intense. It's kind of grounding the climate crisis in the here and right now. The environmental justice movement has sort of come to the forefront of the scene. And it's very much clear that any way out of this mess has to be an environmentally just and equitable one. In so many ways, climate change is at the forefront of the American consciousness. There are bills in Congress right now for the first time in a decade, maybe for the last time in another decade, that approach and tackle climate change. So we're in this very unique moment, and I'm really excited to chat with all of you today because it seems like you are well positioned to explain not only how we got here, but also where do we go from here and what do we do now? So I think the first thing I really want to ask all of you, and this is a question for the whole group, and we'll get into specific questions after, is what are the title of this panel is what are we doing to confront the climate crisis, confronting the climate crisis. So I'm curious, what are each of you doing through the course of your work to confront the climate crisis? And if no one wants to jump in first, maybe Katharine with a C, would you mind going first?
Well, thank you. Well, first of all, I think that's a very good question. What am I doing to confront the climate crisis? First of all, I am having conversations with people to help them understand why we're in this crisis and what we can do about it. I think that we have to do more than just talk about the climate crisis, but we have to talk about actions. And we're also engaged in terms of environmental justice in making certain that as we talk about mediation, that frontline communities are at the forefront of any solutions that are put forward because they're already and have been dealing with climate issues for quite some time. So those are some of the things that I'm doing, and even looking on the private sector to see what other kinds of climate solutions are available and making sure that those communities, again, that have been left behind and overburdened and under-resourced get the opportunity to be able to mediate the situations in their communities and build resilience.
Maybe Colette, if you don't mind going next.
I do not mind following Ms. Catherine Flowers. And I would agree with everything that she said. I think, what I've been doing to confront the climate crisis, it requires just an understanding of what I think the root of the climate crisis is. And, it's one thing to recycle and change, how I live my life and try to live a more values-based life on this planet. Saying no to plastic water bottles that are offered to me, or making sure that, I'm not contributing to waste in the harmful ways that Americans contribute to waste. But it's bigger than that. It's, in my opinion, it's really about our democratic or our political system. And it's about the economic system that is driving it or that is parallel to it. And so one of the things that I've been doing to confront the climate crisis is really to build democracy at the community level from the ground up. We don't even know what it is to make decisions for ourselves, to participate in things that are going to impact us for generations. And so it's time now to connect folks, recreate and build networks that practice democracy so that we have the ability to govern ourselves, not just because we need a new standard of governance, which we do, because this is ridiculous what we're dealing with now, but because in places like the Gulf South, we are left to govern ourselves for days on end, disaster after disaster after disaster. And that governance includes how we recover. It includes how we plan for what's coming next. It also includes how we distribute and collect and distribute resources. And so these are all part of not just how we practice democracy, but how we build an alternative economy and what it is to actually think about the management of our natural resources collectively. And so one of the things we've done over and over again here in the Gulf South is develop these community controlled funds that are controlled by the community and they're distributed by the community, but they go to the things that the community on the front line wants those dollars, resources, and or other supports to go to. These are, it doesn't sound like this is the carbon emissions reduction that we're always looking for, but it is getting to the root of the problem. And this is where I've been spending a lot of my time.
Well, I love this question. It's such an unusual question to start with, but it's such a good one. What are we doing personally? And I loved hearing the answers of my co-panelists too. So first and most obviously, I am a climate scientist because of my concern about the climate crisis. I was quite literally planning to be an astrophysicist.
I was almost finished my undergraduate degree. I was already planning to move on to graduate school. I was already doing research about galaxies clustering around quasars, which is really cool, when I took a class that showed me that the climate crisis is not only an environmental issue. Of course it is, but it is also an issue of our food and our health and the economy and our security. It is most of all a justice issue. It disproportionately affects those who have done the very least to contribute to the problem. And so realizing that, and realizing that I serendipitously, so to speak, had the exact skill set that you needed to develop the information that people need to plan for the future. High resolution climate modeling is my field. That's what led me to become a climate scientist. So I looked at the intersection, as we all do, between what am I good at, what is my skill set, what am I interested in, and where are the gaps that need to be filled. And today I work with people who have expertise in public relations and communication, who have expertise in law or social movements or business or medicine or architecture. Each of us has something unique to bring to the table and something unique to contribute to this. I also, of course, take action in my personal life. Nobody likes a hypocrite, least of all ourselves. And so I love the fact that I have a plug-in car. So during COVID, I didn't have to go to the gas station very much. I love the fact that we've got solar panels. I've changed our family's diet. I do most of my events virtually. But all of that just focuses on my carbon footprint. And even if each of us did everything we could to cut our carbon footprint, that would not tackle the systemic causes of this problem. How do we tackle those systemic causes? By doing what each of the other panelists said, which is using our voice to advocate for change at every level. Using our voice to advocate for better governance, for better preparedness, for more equity, for cleaner sources of energy, for not being so wasteful with the resources we have, for watching out for those who are already marginalized or vulnerable, who are most impacted as climate change supersizes our extreme weather events. Using our voice is something that every single one of us can do, and it's the catalyst for action. Because how can we act together unless we use our voice to communicate with others why it matters and what we can do to fix it? So probably the most important thing that I do to act on the climate crisis is I talk about this non-stop. I talk about it on social media. I give dozens, even over 100 virtual talks a year. I just finished writing a book about how each of us can talk about climate change. I do a YouTube series. I just joined TikTok. Not sure how that's going yet, I'll let you know. But I do everything I can to talk about why this matters and how every single one of us has a role to play in fixing it.
Katharine with a K, let's stay with you. I have a question for you about hope. So you are known as a hopeful climate scientist. And I have to admit that I have not been feeling too hopeful myself lately. There was a major climate summit in Scotland not long ago, less than a month ago. Major nations, the world's most developed countries, are not mostly on track to meet the goals outlined in the Paris Agreement. A lot of nations are just not doing enough. The US is not necessarily doing enough yet. So are you still hopeful? And if so, why?
Well, what gives you hope is the most frequent question I'm asked. And that's really the reason why I wrote my book, is to answer that question. But we have to start off with what is the definition of hope? Because often people have a very visceral, even negative reaction to that word. They say, how can you have any hope? The outlook is so dire. And it is. I'm a scientist. I know how bad it is. I spend every day looking at how bad it is. But hope is not positive circumstances today. And hope is absolutely not the guarantee of a better future. Hope is the small chance of something better if we fight for it and strive for it and encourage each other and help those along who aren't going fast enough and encourage others to move faster. Hope is the chance that we could get to something better. And that chance still exists because we know that, in the words of the science, every bit of warming matters. Before the Paris Agreement, we were heading for a world that would be 4 degrees Celsius, that's about 7 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the world was that our civilization began in. We were heading for a 4-degree warmer world before Paris. Now, after Glasgow, we're currently heading for a 2.6 degree warmer world. That's still too much, but it's better than where we were before. We are talking about the most massive and rapid transformation of our entire society that human civilization has ever experienced. It is happening a lot slower than most of us wish it would. But that giant boulder of climate action, it's not sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep cliff with only a few hands on it. with only Katharine's and Colette's and yours and mine and, maybe Sir David Attenborough, Jane Goodall. No, that giant boulder is already at the top of the hill. It is already rolling down the hill in the right direction, and it has millions of hands on it. At COP, what struck me the most at that big climate conference in Glasgow was that the actual country negotiators were only a tiny fraction of the people there. Who was everybody else? There were children, there were young people, there were senior citizens, there were students, there were business people, people from the nonprofit sector, there were people representing indigenous tribes, there were people representing every type of group you could imagine on the whole face of the planet. And they were all there because their hands were on that boulder, and they were encouraging others to add their hands too. And when we realized that if we add our hand, it will go a little bit faster. And if we encourage others through engaging our shadow rather than just our footprint, if we engage others and encourage others to add their hand, it will go faster yet. I wish I could wave a magic wand and pass all the federal legislation that we could, but we can't. But you know what? Every one of us has a role to play at the city level, at the state level, companies, schools, tribal nations, organizations, neighborhoods, churches. Everybody has a role to play. And again, in the words of the science, every action matters.
Thanks for that, Katharine. Colette, I wanted to ask you about your work. So you work at the intersection of policy and law in the Gulf Coast. And the Gulf Coast is a really interesting and unique place where it's prone to hurricanes, sea level rise, and also home to petrochemical facilities, refineries, a lot of oil and gas industry. So what happens is when there's an environmental disaster, when there's an extreme weather event, it compounds and overlaps with these existing facilities and creates environmental justice issues, human rights issues, health issues. So you work in that overlap. Have you been able to achieve any environmental justice wins in those areas? And more generally, what has your work shown you there?
Mm-hmm. It's a great question. Let me start with the work of the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy is actually broader than just the coast. We started in the coastal areas because of Hurricane Katrina in 2005, and we saw what the front lines look like to these new extreme storms that are coming as the impact of climate change impacts the weather that we were used to, the weather that we grew up with. What we also started to notice was extreme temperatures in the north of the state. A lot of our agriculture being impacted by floods coming down the Mississippi River because of floods happening in the Midwest. So we call the region the Gulf South because it is the entirety of the states, the entirety of Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and Puerto Rico, for us equal the Gulf South states. And those states are not just, the best states in the union, but they're also where we see, as you mentioned, Zoya, the petrochemical companies. It's also where we see the largest prisons. It's where we see the worst schools. It's where we see the worst access to healthcare. It's where we see the least affordable housing. We see the highest energy burden. We see all of these things in the South because what we're dealing with is not just a new climate reality. We're dealing with an old and very calculated colonial history and present, to be quite honest about it. We're still dealing with the legacy of the beginning of this country and all of the wrongs that started where we are now. The petrochemical companies that get flooded in the more extreme weather that comes with warmer temperatures and a changing climate are on the same places where the plantations were. They are on the exact same sites where the plantations were, right on the river. This is not an accident. This is because these economies are rooted in the same philosophy of extraction. When you can no longer extract the value out of the people, extract the value out of the land. And that is what is happening, and that's what we're seeing. I don't work in environmental justice. I do depend on Ms. Katharine and Dr. Wright and Dr. Bullard and other folks like that who are teaching me what it is to every day have an environmental justice issue, not during storms, but every day wonder what kind of air you're breathing, what kind of water you're drinking, what kind of plants are, what's in your plants because the soil is so tainted. The environmental injustices happen before the storms, but the storms certainly make that environmental injustice concern a much more grave and dangerous reality. We are seeing after every storm, facilities that have on a daily basis poison the air, the water, and the soil now be flooded They have explosions, they have releases, and some of these refineries and facilities are releasing very toxic things into the air. After Hurricane Laura in 2020, there was a notice that went across the state that said shelter in place. There's a toxic plume of poisonous cloud above you because that storm. And imagine you're being told to shelter in place when there's no electricity. It's August in Louisiana. You know what that is? Shut your windows, shut your doors, shelter in place in 100-degree heat. This is what we call a recipe for disaster. I think the wins for us have been that people are rising up. It's not just the Black communities that are 80 times more likely to be next to the facilities, or the poor communities that are 100 times more likely to be next to these communities that are rising up. We're starting to see people ask questions about, why is this the industry that Louisiana, the Gulf South, Texas, why do we keep choosing the things that harm us when there are alternatives out here and we could be investing in the things that help us sustain ourselves? So I think the win is Gulf South for a Green New Deal, a 5-state, 1 territory process that's really building movement and momentum toward climate action at the state and municipal level. It's Southern Communities for a Green New Deal, the 13 states that we've got mobilizing around climate action to get a national block moving at the federal level. It's the Red, Black, and Green New Deal that we helped to architect with the Movement for Black Lives to get more Black people to understand that climate is about Black lives. This is the win. The win is that more people are seeing that this is not an issue about polar bears, although it's about polar bears. It's not an issue about trees, although it's about trees, but this is about our lives and how we make it to the next phase of this. So I think the win is people waking up, is people standing up, is people speaking up. We've got a long way to go, especially in states like Louisiana, but I think we're on the right track.
Katharine Flowers, I wanted to ask you a question about public health. I cover public health for Grist. I talk to a lot of doctors who are concerned that the health impacts of climate change, and this is the health impacts of flooding, extreme heat, other disasters, even the mental impacts of those things are really affecting Americans more than they might realize. And I'm wondering if you've seen those impacts, and if you can talk about them a little bit. How does climate change impact public health, and are those impacts spread through the population evenly or equally?
Well, that's a very good question, at least at the intersection where I sit. I deal with sanitation, and sanitation is an issue that's impacted by all the things that you mentioned that are related to climate change, whether it's floods, whether it's drought, because the way we treat our wastewater determines really the health of the community. And I've had the opportunity through my organization, the Center for Rural Enterprise and Environmental Justice, to actually partner with Baylor's National School of Tropical Medicine and to do a study that that really was released in 2017, where we saw evidence of hookworm and other tropical parasites in Alabama. And there's another study now that is being peer reviewed that includes 5 states. Some of us that are a part of this conversation represent each one of the, or come from each one of those states. But it just shows that in these places, we're starting to see more and more tropical parasites. And I believe as the climate changes, we're going to see things living in places that couldn't have lived there before because it's so warm. I've even been contacted by veterinarians from Alaska that are telling me that they're seeing hookworm in dogs there. So those are the kinds of things that are, I think the evidence speaks for itself, that the climate is in fact changing, it is warming, and these kinds of things that we may not have been accustomed to seeing here in the US, in colder areas in the past, we will see more of that. I also believe, and I'm not a scientist, but I believe that things like COVID, it's just the beginning of what we're going to suffer with, because a lot of the things that have been frozen and a lot of these diseases that have been contained in ice will eventually be out here for the world to deal with. And we see how we're having such a hard time dealing with COVID, that there will be other COVID-like illnesses to come that we have to be prepared to deal with. And as we look at these calamities that are taking place, even when Colette talked about people having this shelter in place and having the plume, above them, just imagine having the shelter in place and there's COVID. Because a lot of people had to shelter in place during Ida. Whenever people don't understand how big these storms are. So when the storm comes ashore in Louisiana, we're on the east, I'm in Alabama, we're on the east side of the storm. When we're on the east side of the storm, we have impacts from the storm too. It could be very well be storm surge. It could be lots of rain that ends up in these areas. And we have to be concerned about flash floods. There have been a number of people that have died even recently because of deluges of rain and flash floods. So I think that what we're going to see is more and more parasites that normally don't live in these areas that can cause disease increase. And if we don't do something about it, and we already see that one of the things that COVID has taught us is that our public health system is in shambles. And if people get to the point where they feel like they can't take the precautions to protect everybody else because of what politicians are saying that they support, then we're in trouble. So as I'm happy to say, though, that there are conversations that are taking place with doctors. This morning, I had a seminar with people at Baylor's National School of Tropical Medicine, and I'm glad to see that there are people that are coming together to talk about the public health impacts of climate change. Because I think if we can't reach people any other way, they need to understand how it would impact their health if we don't make a difference and change.
Right. Yeah. The climate impacts of the health impacts of climate change are so varied. It's not just, what you would think of like extreme heat. I wrote about a tick from, I think originated in Texas, that can make you allergic to red meat, the Lone Star tick. There's, all kinds of sort of like sci-fi-esque impacts out there. And I think that we're maybe just starting to grasp the extent of how all these things are going to fundamentally change our world. So thank you for that answer. That was great. I wanted to ask, there was a question from the audience that basically wants to know how climate change became so politicized. And the question, I think, said something like, our lives depend on this issue getting fixed. So why is there so much tension around fixing it? I want to start with Katharine Hayhoe and see whether you have something to say about that. But this question is open to all of you. How did this issue become so politicized? What happened?
Well, I'm just laughing when you say that because that is my life. I am a climate scientist living in the second most politically conservative town in the whole US. I'm on social media and I get hate mail every single day. On a good day, it's 2 or 3. On a bad day, it's more like 20 to 50. And before I block anyone on social media or before I, throw the letter in the trash, I look to see who would wake up in the morning and just decide to hate on somebody that they'd never met before just because they're a scientist telling you what science says. And I can tell you without exception, every single time, their rejection of the science is part of a toxic stew of issues. Vaccine denial, anti-mask, very, very right-wing politics. The president didn't win the election. And climate denial is just a part of that stew of identity issues. So when did climate change join that stew? Sometime in the last 20 years. That is how recent this polarization is. We scientists have known that digging up and burning coal back then, and then gas and oil, releases heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket on the planet, since the 1850s. We were so worried about the impacts on human civilization that scientists formally warned a US president of the risks of climate change and the need for action in 1965. As late as the late 1990s, Republicans and Democrats were completely on the same page about climate change. They weren't nearly as worried as they should be, but they mostly agreed, sure, it was real. And then what happened? The science didn't change. What happened was the impacts started to become obvious. Rather than being far away in time or space, they started to happen here and now. Record hot summers, extended droughts, larger wildfires, bigger hurricanes. And then people started to say, we need to do something about it. Well, what does climate action look like? In a nutshell, 90 corporations, including some of the ones that Colette was talking about, 90 corporations are responsible for 2/3 of carbon emissions since the dawn of the industrial era. And some of them decided it's a lot more affordable for us to cast some doubt on this issue. You scientists aren't really sure. You should really study it some more. Maybe you're in it for the money. You're just trying to line your own pockets with this. And so they deliberately started to introduce doubt through think tanks, through op-eds, through media campaigns, through contributing significantly to political campaigns as well, to muddy the waters. Their goal is not to get everybody to reject climate action. Their goal is just to cause enough uncertainty that nothing happens. And all of this has arisen in the last 20 years. So that's why just telling people more science isn't going to fix the problem. We have to tackle the real issues, which are psychological distance. People don't think it matters to them here and now in ways that are relevant, and solution aversion. People don't think there's any solution that we can do that will leave us better off than we were before. Well, it turns out it's exactly the opposite. Climate change is here. It is now. It is affecting us today, and climate solutions give us immediate benefits. Cleaner air, cleaner water, a more just and equitable society, more jobs, a healthier economy. Oh, and they cut carbon too in the future.
Do either of you want to respond to that as well?
Well, I'd just like to quickly jump in and say that I think the cause for this is really, I think Colette talked about it earlier in terms of this unjust economic system that we have. And it's about money, where profit is put over people. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why we're where we are. And I think that in terms of the divisions that exist, Katharine with the K explained it, I think very succinctly in terms of there are people that it's within their political and economic interests to muddy the waters because they're trying to make more profit, and they care more about profit than they care about people. But those of us that are engaged and involved are concerned not only about ourselves, but in my case, I'm concerned about my 5-year-old grandson, and I'm concerned about those 7 generations that's coming after me. So we have to do whatever it is that we need to do. And coming from the dirty South, especially being here in Alabama, I'm seeing that there's hope. There's glimmers of hope. I was contacted recently by a friend who told me that there was an announcement about an electric vehicle that is going to become available next year. And there were, in this town in Alabama, there were 7,000 orders for that vehicle. I mean, this is a town where people don't even believe that, won't acknowledge anyway, because they don't want to get into arguments with folk that climate change is real. But the fact that, and we just celebrated that small victory, that they want to switch to electric vehicles in a place where the wealthiest people in this state are fossil fuel barons. So I think that there's a lot of hope, despite the fact that there are divisions, and we got to continue to have these conversations.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I would just add in on Catherine Hayhoe's comment about the doubt that was introduced wasn't specifically to convince people that climate change wasn't real. It was just to get enough chaos to spin the wheel so that nothing gets done. And if I add on to that same sentence, I would say, so that nothing gets done until the fossil fuel and extractive corporations get their last ounce of profit out of the planet, because we're dealing with a fossil fuel industry that is absolutely on the decline. Everyone knows it. Renewable energy is absolutely on the increase. Everybody knows it. And so now what we're doing is using federal subsidies and false solutions to guarantee that the same 90 companies still benefit from the situation that they are most responsible for putting the planet in the first place. I'm talking about these false solutions like carbon capture, sequestration, like blue hydrogen, these things that sound so futuristic and wonderful, but they don't address the injustice at the root of all of this, right? So in order to do carbon capture and sequestration, you continue to run the refineries. You continue to run the places that were put in Black and poor places in the first place. You continue to produce, and in order to produce, you have to extract. At no time are we dealing with folks who say, actually, we've taken enough. We've taken enough. We have enough. What we're doing right now cannot continue, and we survive. And I think that in addition to this being about money, which it is, this is about power. And power is often about who controls the people. And it is easiest to control humans through fear. It's a very natural response that we have. It's a response that we need in order to stay alive, right? When we were all of those other older human versions of ourselves, we needed fear to tell us how to get out of the way, to tell us when to move, to tell us when to migrate, to tell us what not to eat. We needed those things, but that we've tapped into, I believe Katharine called it a psychological, something in the psychology, psychological distance. They've tapped into the psychological distance using fear. That's the COVID, that's the vaccine denial, that's the mask thing. And the other piece of that is to say, you have every right to be afraid of everything and everybody. And the only solution you have is yourself. So let us advance this notion of individualism when what we need in a new climate reality is more collectivism. We don't need to go one by one to take on these storms and this heat and these changes. We actually need to be moving as a collective. And so I see the detriment to profit and power when people know their own power and have their own autonomy to advance power and to change things. And this is not just about fossil fuels being extracted. This is about the right to vote being extracted from people. Look how many people we have in a prison system whose right to vote gets taken away. And all of these climate activists saying, what does prisons have to do with climate change? Because they're passing laws now just in that margin of the number of people who can no longer vote. That's what this has to do with prison. So this is about a broader philosophy of extraction that extends throughout our society. And it's about power and people using our fear to control us so that they have power. And I think that makes organizing, that makes grassroots organizing, that makes movement building an essential part of this climate solution, because we have to get the power back to the people. People have to understand that we are responsible for running this government. We are responsible for saying no to these corporations and to this industry. And we are responsible for advancing new solutions. And I think that's the opportunity. This is the moment we're in right now. It's what makes this moment so precious. It's dire, but full of opportunity if we have the courage enough to take back our power and to move collectively and value everybody equally.
So Colette, let's stick with you for a second. I wanted to ask you quickly about the climate change lawsuits. You talked about power and needing to put power back with the people as opposed to maybe some of the oil companies that have been emitting so many emissions over so many years. So there are all these lawsuits across the United States from cities and states, from fishermen, from children against big oil that aim to make some of these oil companies like ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP pay for some of the pollution that they've caused and act to counteract some of the climate change that they're responsible for. I'm wondering what you make of this. And the lawsuits have not been necessarily super successful so far. But do you think that, law is a tool that can be used to sort of rein in these oil companies and change the status quo?
100%. But it's because I believe laws can be and are used to shape our society. If what we want is a better society, then we can use the regulations and the laws that we have on the books to get to that. I think the interesting thing about the legal question and litigation is that many of these oil companies are breaking the law. They're breaking state law, they're breaking federal law, they're breaking international law, they're breaking moral law. And this law is not something that is, it doesn't stay still. It never has. If you think about the laws of our society, laws change. And we need those lawsuits to be filed, not because they're going to win, but because they start changing the conversation in the law schools, in the law reviews, in the court systems. At some point, people have to be exposed to this. Most lawsuits never win at first. Look at tobacco, look at civil rights. These are not things that had successful runs when they first started. But eventually, and especially when people started paying attention to truth and humanity, this is when we start seeing success in the lawsuits. There's the lawsuits that have been filed by future generations. And this is adding in to what we're seeing around the planet. Children who are suing because their right to live and exist has been harmed by fossil fuel companies who, as Katharine Hayhoe mentioned, have known for generations that they were destroying the planet. This is tobacco one more time. This is slavery one more time. They knew very well what was going to happen. And now they need the courts to protect them. But the courts only hold so long. New laws get made, new standards get set, new conversations begin to happen. And these pieces of litigation are essential for shifting our society and shifting the regulations of our society. I'm excited to see not just the litigation against the fossil fuel companies, but to also see lawyers start stepping up, because they're changing state laws now to say it's illegal to protest the pipeline. It's illegal to protest for climate solutions. It's illegal to stand up for water. So now we have our elders in jail, our indigenous water protectors in jail, because they're standing up. So those are lawsuits too. And the litigation that's happening there is to challenge the constitutionality of people standing up for the earth and all of the natural resources that we own and share collectively. I think it's an essential part of change. But as I would say with policy, law follows movement. And so I would say it is a service to the movement that we're seeing on the ground. These pieces of litigation and even some of the creative defenses that we're starting to see come into the courts now, it's because there's a movement afoot. And the movement isn't just about reducing CO2 emissions, it's about saving the people and the planet. It's a powerful movement rooted in justice. And I think the courts have a role to play in that.
Thanks for that. So I've been pretty down on the Biden administration in this conversation so far. I've been pretty skeptical that some of the bills that are in Congress right now are going to pass. However, the Biden administration has done and has taken some significant steps towards righting some of the environmental wrongs that were done during the past administration, the previous administration. There's a lot of movement underway in terms of conversations about tackling the climate crisis. So I'm wondering if we can start with Katharine with a C. Do you feel hopeful, and also what signs do you see that the Biden administration, signs or maybe no signs, that the Biden administration is taking climate change seriously and wants to do something about it?
Well, that's a very good question. I think one of the hopeful things that I see is that the Biden administration formed the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the suggestions that we made back when I was part of the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force that served during the campaign, when they were trying to determine how they were going to deal with climate change and environmental justice. And that was one of the many suggestions that has now been kind of codified. And the interesting thing about the WEJAC is that there are representatives that represent different constituencies throughout the United States as it relates to environmental justice, whether they're indigenous communities in Alaska, in Colorado, people from Puerto Rico, different communities, Flint, Michigan. There are all kinds of representation that is there, and people have been very vocal. People like my colleagues from the South, like Dr. Wright, Dr. Beverly Wright, who are very outspoken, Peggy Shepard from New York and WEAC, that are helping to write, that first of all have written an interim guidance for Justice 40. Justice 40 means that with this last bill that was passed, that 40% of the benefits have to go to those communities that were overburdened and under-resourced, and these are environmental justice communities, even coming down to putting together that we're developing the first ever screening tool that would be an environmental and climate justice screening tool that will determine which communities will receive the funding, and also a scorecard. And this scorecard is going to see where the money is going, because oftentimes what I've seen happen over and over again, whenever there's well-intentioned things that happen, there's people that come and set up shop and then put in place these false solutions, or put in place infrastructure that is not going to last no longer than when the media is gone, and then the people are left in the same situation. So I do feel that there is hope. There are hopeful signs, and the people that are on the WEJAC are not shy. They're very, very vocal about their opposition, even to some of the policies that they see within the administration. And I think they're being heard, and we just have to continue to speak for people in the community. And also there are opportunities for those that that are not a part of the WeJack to actually give comments, and whether they're written or comments that where they're actually participating in the meetings. So I encourage everyone to follow what is happening with the WeJack, because I think it's an opportunity that we've never had before to have some impact on the policy that impacts the communities that we live in.
And Katharine with a K, I wanted to ask you as well, what signs of progress do you see at the federal level?
Well, for a long time, climate change was very much viewed as a siloed issue. So someone might say, well, I care about a healthy and robust economy, so I don't care about climate change. Somebody else might say, I care about gender equity, so climate change is not my thing. Somebody else might even say, well, social justice is where I'm focused, so climate change isn't so urgent for me. But climate change is not a separate bucket. It's the whole in every other bucket. There is no way to fix anything that is wrong, whether it's our crumbling infrastructure, whether it's a faltering economy, whether it's the issues of justice and equity that Katharine and Colette have spoken about so eloquently. We can't fix any of these issues if we leave climate change out of the picture, because it is the hole in the bucket. We have to patch that hole if we're going to fix anything else. And I feel like this administration gets that to a much larger extent than previous ones. And this administration gets the fact that it is a justice issue. Fundamentally, there are ethical and moral reasons to act, not only economic or practical reasons, though there's plenty of those as well. And on a personal note, I have to say that they have just about every great person that I know working for them. They have hired amazing people in all different areas. So not just in the Environmental Protection Agency, not in just the Environmental Justice Committee, but all throughout the administration. They have picked people who absolutely understand that climate change is, as the US military calls it, a threat multiplier. It takes every issue we're concerned about, whether it's housing, food, air quality, national security, and it makes it worse. And so we have to tackle it from that holistic perspective, because if not, we're never going to fix it. But I would say this, and this is really important. It's not only up to the federal government to save us. It's up to every single one of us to save ourselves. Again, it's our human civilization that's at risk here. And every single one of us has not only a footprint like I talked about before, but we have a shadow. We are all part of things that are greater than ourselves. We all live in a city or a state or a region or a county. We all have a place of work or a place of worship or a school that we go to or a school our child goes to. We all have connections with other people. And through activating each other together to work for these solutions at every single level, from the neighborhood level to the state level to the federal level to the global level, that is how we're going to change the world.
Great. I have one more lightning round question for all three of you. I'm going to start with Colette. So at the beginning of this conversation, I said that we're sort of in this like amazing moment where it seems like there are two pathways before us. You can kind of envision both, right? Like there's sort of a dark, sad, scary path where we don't take enough action on climate change and things get really, really bad. There is a light-filled, hopeful path where, world governments can get together and actually do something about this, where the individual takes control and where the power is kind of given back to people. And I'm wondering if each of you could maybe describe that vision. What is your vision for that hopeful path? What would you like to see in the next decade, 2 decades? I mean, when you imagine the future that you're working so hard for right now, what do you see, Colette?
I see a more courageous leadership. I am not impressed with the Biden administration in any way. And I think that what we're seeing right now is a disrespect, I hope, just an ignorance and not something more sinister to the realities that we're facing in the US and that the rest of the planet is already facing. We have nothing near what we need to tackle this problem and to say that this administration is taking this seriously. We need more courageous leadership. And I envision a future where, regardless of what political party and regardless of what campaign dollars help to get you there, that standing up for the existence of the planet and the people on it is paramount and not something that can be compromised by dollars. I envision a future where we phase out the fossil fuel industry. We stop all public dollars going to fossil fuel infrastructure build outs right now, pipelines, railways, refineries, all of the things that go into building this dirty, nasty, poisonous, toxic stuff in our communities, and instead use every single dollar that we would invest in these new pieces of fossil fuel infrastructure and put them into renewable energy, to stop all federal subsidies to the fossil fuel companies and use them for restoration of our land and our water and our air. I envision a future where folks are able to actually access not just the healthcare that they need in an emergency, but the preventative and restorative health properties that we need to have healthier lives. If we had better food, we'd have healthier lives. If we have less pesticides, less mass agriculture produced food, we would have healthier lives, and we would stop blaming people for making poor individual decisions and instead start fixing some of these systems. I envision a democracy where everybody has the right to vote, where we value the voices of the people, where we move collectively and we move with the intention of sustainability and preserving and advancing humanity to its fullest potential.
Well, I imagine, when I envision what the future could hold, or the future that I would like to see, I kind of reflect back on when I was a kid and I would go to Sunday school. And in Sunday school, we talked about a world where everyone was equal and just. And it was out of those visions where my parents and others were engaged and involved in the Lowndes County Freedom Organization, which was the original Black Panther Party in Lowndes County, Alabama. And it was very significant to voting rights history. And I grew up in an activist background with my parents, being extremely active. And I think they kind of propelled me into what I do today. But out of that vision, at that time, we talked about what we call, having brotherhood. And I'm probably the oldest one on this panel, so I can reflect back to, the Jetsons when I was a kid watching the Jetsons on television, and we didn't have. And if I think back, the Jetsons didn't have fossil fuel, and they were actually able to travel and do things. Some of the things that we're doing today, like using cell phones or having meetings and panels over Zoom. Those are the kinds of things that we imagine. But I also imagine that it's just and there's equitable access, where we can go to places in Lowndes County that don't have internet access now, and they will have it in the future, where people don't have to leave their family property to get decent housing because they don't have to live in mobile homes that they have to flee every time there's a storm, where people can go to the hospital or whatever if they need to go and get the kind of quality health care that they're supposed to get. That it won't happen like it happened to me, where I went to a doctor last year who was supposed to do surgery on me and cut the vein to my spleen right before we shut down for COVID. And then I had to go back and have my spleen removed and forever be immunocompromised because of a mistake. But because the laws in the state protect the doctor, there's nothing I can do about it. And I feel that is what we need to change. We need to have a just society where my grandson can walk through a community, breathe clean air, clean water, and don't have to worry about becoming a victim because he's seen as a criminal. And all of these things are connected. I feel that in order for us to get to the society that we need to get to globally, we're going to have justice at the center. And without there won't be any climate justice, and there certainly won't be any environmental justice.
I envision a world that is green and thriving. Remember the first weeks of the pandemic when people were posting pictures of blue sky in some of the most polluted cities in the world, when they were posting pictures of wildlife roaming through the streets or the canals. A world where humans can live in harmony with nature, because nature protects our physical health. It filters our air and our water. It restores our mental health. Children being outside in nature, they've measured huge positive impacts. And for most of us, just going for a walk in nature, it just restores our sense of balance and connectedness. Walkable cities where people can interact with their neighbors instead of walling ourselves off with our fences and our cars. Places where we live somewhere that generates all of its own electricity. So we have homes that are resilient, that are suited to the climate that we're in, that generate all the resources that we need, where energy and electricity and food and clean water, things that we take for granted that even in this country are not available to all, are just so freely available that nobody thinks twice about the basic essentials of life. The United Nations has a list of sustainable development goals: no poverty, zero hunger, access to basic sanitation. Well over 1 billion people in the world don't even have basic sanitation. That means a toilet or some way to dispose of your waste. Things that we just often take for granted until we no longer have them, which is increasingly happening under climate-fueled disasters. A world where all of those things are so available that we just take them for granted, and people are able to flourish along with nature and reach their full potential. That's a world that I would love to live in.
Thank you all so much for this amazing discussion. I've learned so much. I hope the audience has learned a lot. Thanks again for taking the time to chat. Thanks the 19th. Thanks, Grist. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our panelists and to everyone who joined us today. And a special thanks to our exclusive sponsor, the Walton Family Foundation, for making this event possible. And that wraps up our virtual event series for 2021. If you want to be among the first to hear about the events we've got planned for 2022, sign up now at 19thnews.org/subscribe. And a final thanks to the thousands of members who support our nonprofit newsroom. Your donations make conversations like today's possible. If you're not a 19th News member yet, you can become one at 19thnews.org/membership. We look forward to welcoming you to the 19th News family, and we'll see you next year.